So you went to Afghanistan for with Asia Week in 1981.
That's right.
Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, it was amazing because I'd been to the country before when I was still at university, but I hadn't been back and I didn't really know it. And at that time, in the early 80s, right after the Soviet invasion, to work with the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, you had to literally walk in or go in with an arms caravan with them, right? And to get to the north of Afghanistan, which was the area that I particularly wanted to work in, particularly the northeast, Badakhshan, because I'd heard about this guy, Ahmad Shah Massoud, who later became very famous, right, and was killed tragically 2 days before 9/11. So I'd heard about him, and I'd heard about the Panjshir Valley where he operated, and that was in the northeast. So that was where I wanted to go. And in order to get there, through most of the decade when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, you had to walk 2 weeks to get there, right, over the Hindu Kush. So you'd leave Pakistan, you'd walk up very high passes, 16,000, 17,000 feet, and then come down on the other side into the Hindu Kush on the Afghan side. So, yeah, I mean, it was sort of, for somebody who'd been working in Southeast Asia, when you got on a bus to get up to Mesot to go and visit the Karen or this, that, and the other, right? Suddenly you got to walk 2 weeks with not a lot of food to get to the story before you start actually covering what the resistance and the Russians are doing to each other. So that was a bit of a shock. And the first time I went in, I can remember, yeah, it was pretty, I wasn't psychologically prepared, and I wasn't, to a degree, I was physically prepared because I wasn't sick, but it was tough.
How did you get the contacts to get in there in the first place?
Well, because all these parties, all these resistance parties had offices in Peshawar, right?
Right.
Looked after by the Pakistani military intelligence, naturally, right? But they all had their own offices, and there were 7 different parties, right? Slightly different ideological perspectives, a little, more or less Islamist, more or less conservative, whatever, right? But they all had offices. So you go to the office in Peshawar, you say, look, I'm working for, in my case, Asia Week magazine. I want to go to see Ahmad Shah Massoud. And I'm going to his party, right?
Like a travel agent for journalists, yeah?
Well, except there was not a lot of business in those days, mate, because not a lot of journalists wanted to have to walk 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time I went to Afghanistan in 81, I crossed the border at the end of August that year, and I came out at the beginning of December. So I wasn't filing any stories there because all the areas that we were operating in were in the countryside. The Russians and the communist government held the cities and the roads, right? The Mujahideen, the resistance, held the countryside, more or less, right? So you couldn't just rock up to the nearest, post office and send in your report or ring anybody. This was before sat phones, certainly before mobile phones. So, yeah, for 3 months plus, I was off the grid. And then when I got back to Pakistan and back to Bangkok, then I wrote, a long cover story for the magazine, and they were happy, and it was interesting, da-da-da-da. But, yeah, it was, technologically, it was a whole different era. And then in the 90s, you were on sat phones, right? So I can remember after 9/11, before the fall of Kabul in November 2001, right, using a sat phone the whole time, right? And, it was a big, bulky sat phone, and you put it up.
This is when the Taliban...
This was when the Taliban had already taken Kabul and were getting kicked out of Kabul by the Americans, right? But I'm just referring to the difference in technology. For the first 10 years, there were no sat phones, no mobile phones, nothing. And I can remember one interesting anecdote, actually. It was in 1982, I was in the north, and the group that I was with overran a district center, a place called Narin. And for them, this was a big deal, right? I mean, nobody outside of Afghanistan probably ever heard of Narin. But for them, it was where they operated, and they'd just taken the district center. So I'm with them, and I'm taking pictures, and I'm recording events, right? Noting it all down, this, that, and the other. So the commander comes up to me, and he says, look, Tony, look what we've done, right? This is good stuff. We want the word to get out. So I said, well, it's 3 weeks walk out of here. If you give me a horse, it might be 2, but in any event, it ain't going to happen in the coming days. So he went away and he said, look, how about this? Can you write a story on this piece of white cloth? And I thought, what the hell are you talking about? So I said, yes. So he said, what we're going to do is this. You write your report in ink on this large piece of white cloth, right? How Narin fell, the group that took it, my name naturally, the commander's name, and this, that, and the other. And what we'll do is, when you've written the report, we'll sew it into the jacket of this old greybeard, this old guy, who can get on a bus and go to Kabul, and from Kabul he'll get on another bus and go to Pakistan, and when he gets to Pakistan, he'll go to the BBC office in Peshawar, right? So I said, yeah, that could work. So sure enough, I wrote the story. It took me a couple of hours, whatever. They did exactly that. This old geezer, who was no problem for anybody, right? The Russians weren't going to arrest him or anything. He goes to Pakistan, takes the piece of paper to the BBC office, and sure enough, we're listening on the shortwave 3 days later, the fall of Narin is publicized by the BBC to the world. So, you know, I'm their journalist. You know, that's exactly what they wanted. But I mean, in terms of technology, it's a long-winded anecdote to just say how basic things were covering that war. And yeah, I mean, technology has changed dramatically. I mean, in my working lifetime, not just my lifetime, in my working lifetime, from typewriters, telex machines in Bangkok down the road, right? We're now, you know, you bang it out on your laptop or even on your mobile phone, click, and it's gone, right? It's a new world.
You're mentioning that you went a caravan for arms dealers. Basically, the arms were taken to the front line or whatever. Yeah, it sort of comes back to one thing: where are the different insurgency groups getting their arms from?
Well,
it seems just so simple.
Well, at that time it was not simple, but it was clear what was going on. We're in the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
So superpowers are providing arms. So all the weapons that went into Afghanistan, and I was going in there 3 times a year, right? Every year I'd go in maybe 3 times, each time with an arms convoy, 100 mules laden with rocket launchers, with ammunition, with rifles, with this, that, and the other, right? And by the end, with Stinger missiles. So that was all coming from Uncle Sam, right? Now, Uncle Sam didn't want his own fingerprints on it, so Uncle Sam got the Saudis to kick in some money, the Chinese to kick in some money. Chinese weapons were there. They were buying from the Israelis who'd captured Soviet weapons from the Palestinians in '82. They were getting all this stuff on the international grey or black market, right? Shipping it to Karachi. Pakistan Military Intelligence put it in their trucks. National Logistics Cell, NLC, up to Peshawar, and then it'd go up to the border in other trucks, and then onto the backs of donkeys and into the guys using it in Afghanistan. But I mean, that was in the, and the Russians, of course, were doing the same thing on their side.
Right.
So that was the Cold War. Now it's a very different ballgame, right? I mean, there are not so many conflicts going on now because we're beyond the Cold War and the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. But getting weapons today, yeah, the international arms black market exists. And I imagine people are making millions of dollars out of it. But it's much more complicated than it was in the Cold War period.
Right. So the insurgents, you're also talking about, you sewed this story in this guy's jacket and you moved, you submitted to the BBC. Just now with insurgents groups, okay, you said because of the Cold War there's less insurgency, but there's still insurgency out there. Yeah. Do you think with the media that there's like an encouragement for more violent acts to be able to be caught within the media because there's so many insurgency events going on around the world?
Sorry, your question is, does the media drive conflict?
Yeah, you got it. That was a better question I could make.
No, I don't think people risk their lives and get killed or kill because they want to be on TV. No, I mean, conflict. I mean, you take what's happening in Myanmar, in Burma right now, across the border, right? People are really angry. And as in Afghanistan in the early 80s, people who a few months ago might have been teachers or lawyers or farmers or whatever, are now learning how to use guns and kill people, right? And it's got nothing to do with the media. I mean, if you look at Burma today, one of the big problems is the lack of good, impartial coverage. There's a lot of social media stuff, right, which is influenced by obviously by the groups that are taking it, right? So they're not going to tell you when they're screwing up, right? They're going to tell you when they've done a, quote, good job, right? But the fact is that what is lacking well, I'm making 2 points. One is that none of this is happening because of the media. It's happening because people are genuinely angry, right? And for whatever reason, for whatever cause.
To every story. Myanmar is quite different. It's pretty clear cut. Yeah? But there's two sides. Like, you know, when we were brought up as kids in Northern Ireland, yeah, you had one side saying one thing and another side saying another, and just the general population said, "Listen, we don't care. We just want to have a good life." Yeah. But there was different viewpoints put out there, and the media, some media would support one side more than the other. Yeah. And they would report on things that were like inciting things through the media. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, obviously in any conflict, media will be used by both sides.
Yes.
So you take Myanmar today, which is a serious conflict right next door, in which we understand essentially what has happened. The military junta has its own media, which is pumping out its side of the story every day, right? By the same token, the opposition to the junta is through various Burmese mainstream publications and also through social media putting out its side of the story. Now, if your question is, does that media coverage drive the conflict? I think the answer is no. The conflict has a dynamic of its own. It's got roots of its own. And the media, as has always been the case, is reflecting different sides of a conflict.
Within yourself, just now you're working for Jane's, yeah? And you report on terrorism, insurgency, weapons proliferation, narcotics trafficking, transnational organised crime, and
everything that could possibly go wrong.
Interstate relations in the Asian region. So it's quite a mouthful of what you actually do. How do you keep up with the facts?
One of my biggest professional problems is trying to figure out how much of any given day I need to be spending monitoring what's going on, right? In all the areas you mentioned, or at least some of them, right? And how much to actually devote to producing content or coverage, right? It's a serious issue, because if you spend all your time writing, but you're not keeping up with stuff, then you're losing touch. And it's very tempting to spend a lot of time, you know, clicking on another story from this story and following that link and the other link, because you're telling yourself, I need to know this stuff, I need to keep up. And arguably I do. I mean, I've got a stack of papers on my desk, printed out, interesting stuff by other people, which I need to read in order to be able to analyze what I'm seeing and thinking, right? So there's this continual sort of balance which has to be kept, or imbalance which has to be avoided in terms of monitoring and keeping up and actually producing, which is how I earn a living.
But do you actually have stringers or people you can speak to in certain areas, like you report?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I've got stringers, implies they're sort of on a payroll, which in the case of one person who helps me in southern Thailand is the case. I put out a report on the conflict in southern Thailand every month, right? Which generates a certain amount of income, so I can afford to pay a lady in Songkhla to do a lot of the monitoring day to day for me, right? We work on it together. So I have people like that. I've got a range of contacts who I can talk to in Burma, in Myanmar, ask them their opinion, ask them facts, ask them this, that, and the other. So yeah, I mean, you can't operate on your own. You need a range of people working with you.
Okay, so within the this region, well, not this region, the Arab Spring, as an example, was a conflict which started in probably Libya, etc., and then it's expanded from there. Yeah, do you see that the Middle Eastern issue ever calming down, or do you see something happening Southeast Asia or with the Chinese, or what do you see expansions?
I mean, where is the sort of the main locus of conflict?
Let's just say the Arab Spring. We had the Arab Spring, which is just spread. Yeah? Do you think that's going to be resolved, or it's just an ongoing thing? Is it because they're
Well, let me sort of preface what I could say by making a very clear point. I'm not an Arabist, right? So I'm aware of what's happening in the Middle East because I read the newspapers, same as anybody else. But I don't follow this stuff. I have enough problems following what's going on in this region without pulling the Middle East into it. But some things I do follow. So, yeah, I mean, there are fundamental problems in the Middle East of demography, of water, of Israelis and Palestinians, of Iran as an emerging power, all this sort of stuff. It's not going away, right? So, I mean, whether you can connect that necessarily to the Arab Spring, I think is a different question. And the Arab Spring arguably turned straight to winter, right? I mean, democracy did not remarkably cover the region, right? I mean, we be it started in Tunisia, then it moved to Libya. We saw what happened in Libya. We know what happened in Iraq. I mean, Western democracy or Western-style parliamentary democracy, you could argue, is more the exception than the rule, right? And it isn't easy for it to take root in places where a lot of other things are going wrong and where perhaps the culture is fundamentally inhospitable to parliamentary democracy.
I think you're exactly correct, because I think when you look at the West, there's a case where we're actually pushing our culture on somebody else, which is not their culture, and they want to retain their culture, and then us forcing them to change basically exacerbates other problems. They've got enough internal issues to deal with, never mind us coming in to change the whole scenario of their culture, etc. So.
That's
okay,
right.
So within, for example, just now we've got the Sparrow Islands, we've got the issues that people are talking about with China, and China seems to be favourable one moment and unfavourable the next. They want the money for the development, but they don't want them to influence the way a country is run. Cambodia being one example. Yeah, I think they were saying, listen, we don't want you to invest anymore. Yeah, they took the money at the beginning, and they don't want that. Say blackmail or
the Cambodians?
Yeah, in the south. Yeah. Anyway, my question really is, do you see that China, there could be an issue with China with Southeast Asian nations, primarily around Sparrow Islands, and do you think that's going to build up, be more of an issue now? The US and the UK and Australia seem to be.
Yeah, I mean, Southeast Asia is the sort of the meat in the middle of the sandwich, isn't it? I mean. China is a rising, expanding economic superpower, right? I heard a statistic the other day that, maybe depending on how you measure it, they're already ahead of America, of the United States economically, but within another decade, they're going to be close to 50% ahead. So this is an economic powerhouse which isn't stopping, right? Short of war. Within that context, obviously, China's military might is going to grow in a commensurate manner, right? It would be totally illogical for that not to happen. So you're dealing with a new, and compared to the Soviet Union, a much more cohesive, robust superpower on the block, right?
Right.
And then you've got the United States, which has been the primary power in the Western Pacific since the end of World War II, which is now challenged. And a lot of the competition economic, geostrategic, is going to be happening in Southeast Asia. So how Southeast Asia reacts to that is one of the questions of the day, very clearly.
Yeah, it's just, you see there's more, like Thailand is purchasing more submarines and things like that. Is that because of a fear, or is that because they just have to upgrade because everything is so old, or they never had any submarines?
Well, I mean, the whole Thai submarine program, that's a different sort of, I think it's a bit of a rabbit hole, which I'm not sure it's useful
we'll
going
into Thailand
down.
a little bit
Well, yeah,
later.
we can talk about Thailand later if you want, but I think in terms of Southeast Asia, in the context of superpower competition, which is what it is, hopefully not conflict, but definitely competition, right? Southeast Asia, in a sense, you could say, perhaps tritely, it needs to get its act together. I mean, if ASEAN can't come together in a more cohesive manner, which is not easy, given the differences of political systems, of cultures, of languages. I mean, this is a hugely diverse region, right? But unless ASEAN can sort of come together, they could end up getting picked apart, right? And we're already seeing this happening. I mean, you mentioned Cambodia, Chinese investment in Cambodia, Chinese investment in Laos, Chinese trains into Laos. Chinese obviously have a very assertive position in Thailand, not surprisingly, given history and given the Sino-Thai community. Southeast Asian nations, if they don't come together separately, they're going to get picked apart. Sorry, if they don't come together as a bloc, they're going to get picked apart separately, arguably. That's one scenario looking forward.
So if you look at what happened in Afghanistan, I think everyone was disgusted in how they went about leaving Afghanistan, yeah? So with that happening, let's say the US and the UK primarily, yeah? How do you see other nations wanting to work with these with the US and UK, yeah, on the basis of where they just dump them, yeah? Do you think that has affected the support for the US and UK?
At a certain level, yes. I mean, the optics of August this year in Afghanistan could hardly have been worse. There was a degree of the Americans have run away again, they left the Afghans in the mess, et cetera, right? But America hasn't run away. It's not going to, I mean, it's not in Afghanistan anymore, that's for sure, right? And the major beneficiary there will, of course, be China, which will be willing to work in Afghanistan with the Taliban. That's not a problem for the Chinese. So they're going to pick up on America's defeat. But I think if you look at the shift of American focus and power to Southeast Asia and East Asia, in either region, are under any illusions the Americans are headed back to Hawaii, it's not going to happen. America is reinforcing its hard power and, as far as it can, its economic and soft power in these regions. And yeah, the fight is on. So getting bogged down in, tragic scenes of Afghans hanging onto airplanes taken off at Kabul airport, that could be a bit of a distraction. And as I say, when it comes to East Asia and Southeast Asia, the battle is on.
Okay, so and what do you see the biggest threat to world society just now? Big wide question.
The big wide question. Well, I mean, all I can do is sort of repeat what you'll have heard 100 times before. I mean, the biggest, arguably the most immediate threat is nuclear war, right? So were the Chinese to decide, were Chairman Xi Jinping to decide that now is the time to go for Taiwan, and the Americans come in on the side of the Taiwanese, then you're gonna be in a kinetic conflict between two superpowers, which could very, very conceivably go nuclear, right? Tactically first, and then who knows? We're totally uncharted territory. We haven't been there before. So the threat of nuclear war is probably as serious now as it was back in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, right? I mean, I can remember as a kid, listening to my parents, not really understanding what they were saying, talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? And what would we do if people started pressing buttons, right? And we're sort of...
As you would say, kiss your ass goodbye.
Something like that. Well, no, I mean, there was a whole industry in America in those days of, going underground, of bunkers, of school kids being told to get under their desks in middle America, for Christ's sake, right? Yeah, I mean, the human capacity for survival is significant. So, that's the most immediate. And then, of course, if you want to look further out, we're talking global warming. So is that inflated? Are we more worried about global warming than we should be? Are there scare tactics being used? These are big questions. You find better people to answer them than me.
On the military stage, we talked about nuclear, yeah? But do you think there's going to be a build-up of the arms race around, not necessarily nuclear, could be tactical as well, but do you think there's going to be a build-up of an arms race in Southeast Asia around the world? Or is it just natural progression that's been happening anyway? Yeah? Is there more?
If you're talking Southeast Asia, I don't think it's going to be an arms race that runs out of control as conflict becomes, as competition, let's use that word, becomes more robust, competition between America and China, more robust in the region. There is good reason to imagine that regional powers are going to want to modernize their militaries. That's already happening, right? You mentioned the Thai submarine program. That's one example of that. You can see it in Myanmar, despite everything else that's going on. You can see it across the region. Regional militaries are modernizing, right? With bigger, better kit. Is it an arms race? No, I don't think so, because a race implies you're competing with others, right? So the Vietnamese are not increasing their military capacity because they're trying to compete with Thailand or the Philippines, right? They're increasing their military capacity because they're worried about what might happen in the South China Sea, most obviously, right? So that's a contingency plan. So I don't think it's an arms race in the classic sense.
Is your family not concerned about what you do? Is it with safety? Are you concerned for the family?
I mean, if you compare my lifestyle now with what I did in the 1980s, it's very different. So, I mean, now I can go down to southern Thailand, right? I know southern Thailand, the 3 provinces where the conflict is, really, really well. I know every ampere, every district. It's not really any more dangerous than driving a motorcycle in Bangkok, arguably a lot less, right? And I do that every day. Yeah. So, you've got to keep these things in perspective. I mean, I'm very, very lucky to have found a wife who I know worried at the time, but was not on my case.
Right.
She knew that this is what I did, and she put up with it, and I'm eternally grateful for that. Okay. And I guess it's something which a lot of journalists, some are lucky enough to have, others don't. But it would have been a real strain on me to have her whining and moaning every time I headed to the airport, and that never happened.
Thank you very much for your time for this part 1. Yeah? And if anyone, for those who are watching, if you get any questions or comments, excuse me, please send them through. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Comments, likes, and shares are much appreciated. And we'll see you in part 2. Speak to you later.